Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Tonight we journey into the shadowed world of the 5th century, when the Roman Empire trembled before a single name: Attila the Hun. Called the Scourge of God, he rose from the vast plains of Central Asia to become the terror of Europe, feared and respected in equal measure. His story is one of conquest and mystery, of fleeting glory and sudden downfall. Let us begin. In the year 375, when the Western world still believed in the eternal nature of Rome, a great shadow began to move across the steppes of Central Asia. It was not visible to the senators who debated in marble forums, nor to the merchants who traded along Mediterranean shores, but it would soon reshape the destiny of Europe itself. This shadow was the migration of a people whose very name would become synonymous with terror and destruction, yet whose story began not with conquest, but with survival in one of the harshest environments on earth. The Huns emerged from the vast grasslands that stretched from the Altai Mountains to the Caspian Sea, a region so immense that a rider could travel for months without seeing anything but rolling plains beneath an endless sky. Here, where winter winds could freeze a man to death in minutes, and summer heat could bake the earth to concrete hardness, nomadic peoples had learned to live in harmony with forces that would destroy sedentary civilizations. These were not the primitive savages that Roman historians would later describe, driven by nothing more than bloodlust and greed. The Huns were the inheritors of sophisticated traditions that had evolved over millennia on the steppes. Their society was built around the fundamental reality of movement, where survival depended not on walls or fortifications, but on the ability to read the subtle signs of weather, grass, and water that determined where life could be sustained across vast distances. The horse was the foundation of everything, not merely a means of transportation, but the very center of Hun existence. Their animals were small by modern standards, but possessed an endurance that seemed almost supernatural to those who encountered them. A Hun warrior might travel 100 miles in a single day, switching between fresh mounts in a relay system that allowed unprecedented mobility across the landscape. Children learned to ride before they could walk properly, strapped to their mothers' backs as entire families moved with the seasonal rhythms of grass and weather. But the Huns were more than simple herders. They were the descendants of peoples who had built vast empires on the steppes, who had developed complex systems of governance and warfare adapted to their environment. The composite bow was perhaps their greatest technological achievement, a weapon that combined horn, sinew, and wood in a construction so sophisticated that it could drive an arrow through armor at distances that astounded their enemies. Unlike the simple wooden bows used by many peoples, the Hun bow was a masterpiece of engineering, compact enough to be used from horseback, yet more powerful than weapons twice its size. Their military organization reflected the fluid nature of steppe society. Rather than rigid hierarchies based on birth or geography, Hun armies were built around personal loyalty and proven ability. A successful leader could attract followers from many different tribes and clans, creating coalitions that might number in the tens of thousands. These confederations could fragment and reform with remarkable speed, allowing the Huns to concentrate overwhelming force at critical points, then disperse before retaliation could be organized. The first Europeans to encounter this system found it baffling and terrifying. Roman generals were accustomed to facing enemies who fought in predictable formations, whose strategies could be anticipated and countered through established doctrine. The Huns fought like no enemy Rome had ever faced, appearing suddenly from unexpected directions, striking with devastating effect, then vanishing into the landscape as if they had never existed. The Gothic kingdoms north of the Black Sea learned this bitter lesson in the 370s, when Hun raiders began probing their territories. What began as isolated attacks soon escalated into a full-scale invasion that swept away Gothic power in a matter of years. King Ermanaric, whose realm had stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, found his armies shattered by an enemy that refused to stand and fight in conventional terms. The Goths were brave warriors, but their tactics were suited to warfare against other Germanic tribes, not against the swift-striking horsemen of the steppes. The collapse of the Gothic kingdoms sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Hundreds of thousands of refugees fled westward, carrying tales of terror that spread fear far beyond the regions directly affected by Hun expansion. These refugees would eventually cross the Danube into Roman territory, setting in motion the chain of events that would lead to the sack of Rome itself. But in those early years, the Huns remained mysterious figures, known more by their effects than by direct contact. Roman diplomats and merchants who ventured into Hun territory brought back reports that seemed to blend fact with fantasy. They described a people who lived entirely on horseback, who slept and ate in the saddle, who never built permanent settlements, but moved constantly across the grasslands like a force of nature. Their faces were described as broad and flat, their eyes small and dark, their heads artificially elongated through binding in infancy. They were said to eat raw meat tenderized beneath their saddles, to drink mare's milk and the blood of their enemies. Some of these descriptions contained kernels of truth, but they were filtered through Roman prejudices and fears that transformed cultural differences into marks of barbarism. The reality was that Hun society possessed its own sophisticated traditions and values, evolved over centuries of life on the steppes. They were master metalworkers who created weapons and ornaments of remarkable beauty and effectiveness. Their textiles, woven from the wool of their flocks, displayed patterns and colors that rivaled anything produced in Roman workshops. They were skilled in astronomy and navigation, able to find their way across trackless wastes using stars and subtle environmental cues. Most importantly, they were governed by codes of honor and loyalty that bound their society together across vast distances and cultural differences. A Hun warrior's word was his bond, and betrayal of one's oath-sworn leader was the ultimate disgrace. This system created fierce loyalty within Hun confederations, but it also meant that leadership was constantly tested through success in warfare and the distribution of wealth among followers. It was in this world of endless horizons and eternal movement that Attila's family rose to prominence. His grandfather, whose name is lost to history, had been among the first Hun leaders to establish regular contact with the Roman Empire, extracting tribute and negotiating agreements that recognized Hun power along the imperial frontiers. These early diplomatic relationships established precedents that would prove crucial in later years, as the Huns learned to play the Eastern and Western Roman empires against each other in pursuit of maximum advantage. Attila's father, Mundzuk, inherited this growing power and expanded it through a combination of military success and diplomatic skill. He understood that the old ways of simple raiding were giving way to something more complex and potentially more profitable. The Roman Empire, despite its apparent strength, was increasingly dependent on barbarian allies and mercenaries to defend its borders. This dependence created opportunities for ambitious Hun leaders to position themselves not merely as enemies of Rome, but as indispensable partners in the complex balance of power that was emerging across Europe. Under Mundzuk's leadership, the Hun Confederation began to evolve from a traditional nomadic society into something resembling a state. Tribute flowed in from various sources, allowing the accumulation of wealth on a scale previously unknown among steppe peoples. This wealth, in turn, attracted more followers and allowed the support of larger armies. The old cycle of seasonal migration began to give way to more permanent arrangements, with established winter quarters and regular diplomatic relations with settled peoples. Yet even as Hun society adapted to new circumstances, it retained the fundamental characteristics that had made it successful on the steppes. Mobility remained paramount, with the ability to move large forces quickly across vast distances. Personal loyalty continued to be the foundation of political organization, with leaders maintaining power through their ability to provide victory and wealth to their followers. The horse remained central to everything, both practically and symbolically, representing the freedom and power that distinguished the Huns from the increasingly constrained and bureaucratic societies they encountered. By the time of Mundzuk's death, sometime in the early years of the 5th century, the Hun Confederation had become one of the major powers of Europe. Their territories extended from the Volga River to the Carpathian Mountains, and their influence reached even further. Roman emperors courted Hun friendship and feared Hun enmity in equal measure. Gothic and other Germanic kingdoms sought Hun alliance as protection against their enemies. The stage was set for the emergence of a leader who would unite these growing powers under a single will and direct them toward objectives that would shake the foundations of the civilized world. That leader would be Attila, though his path to power was far from predetermined. In the fluid world of steppe politics, succession was rarely automatic, and leadership had to be won through demonstration of the qualities that commanded respect among the warrior peoples of the grasslands. The young man, who would one day be called the Scourge of God, would first have to prove himself worthy of following the traditions established by his fathers, while simultaneously transforming those traditions to meet the challenges of a changing world. The exact year of Attila's birth remains lost in the mists of steppe tradition, where the measurement of time followed the rhythms of seasons and generations rather than the precise calculations of settled civilizations. Most historians place his emergence into the world sometime between 405 and 410, when the Hun Confederation was still consolidating the territories it had won through decades of expansion and diplomacy. He was born not in a palace or fortress, but in the traditional manner of his people, in a yurt that could be dismantled and moved with the changing needs of the pastoral life. The name Attila itself tells us much about the world into which he was born. Rather than being purely Hun in origin, it appears to derive from Gothic linguistic roots, meaning little father or beloved father. This multilingual heritage reflects the complex nature of the Hun Confederation, which had grown to encompass not only the original steppe peoples, but also Gothic, Allan, Germanic, and Slavic groups that had been absorbed through conquest, alliance, or voluntary submission. Young Attila grew up in a world where multiple languages were spoken around the same fire, where different traditions mingled and influenced each other in ways that would have been impossible in more rigid societies. His father, Mundzuk, was by this time one of the most prominent leaders in the Hun Confederation, though the exact nature of his authority remains somewhat mysterious to modern scholars. The Huns did not organize themselves according to the centralized monarchies familiar to Roman observers. Instead, their society was built around overlapping networks of loyalty and kinship that could expand or contract based on circumstances and personal relationships. Mundzuk held power because others chose to follow him, and he maintained that power through his ability to provide victory, wealth, and protection to his supporters. From his earliest memories, Attila would have been immersed in the traditions that bound Hun society together. Storytelling was central to these traditions, with elders recounting the great deeds of ancestors around evening fires that cast dancing shadows across the interior of yurts. These stories were not mere entertainment, but the repository of cultural memory, containing lessons about honor, loyalty, courage, and the proper relationship between leaders and followers. Young Attila would have absorbed these tales along with his mother's milk, learning the values that would later guide his actions as a leader. The physical training that prepared Hun children for adult life began almost from birth. Infants were strapped to cradle boards and carried on horseback from their earliest days, accustoming them to the motion and rhythm that would dominate their lives. By the age of 3 or 4, children were given their own small ponies and taught the rudiments of riding. The bond between rider and horse was considered sacred among the Huns, representing not merely a practical skill, but a spiritual connection to the forces that governed steppe life. Archery training began equally early, with children using small bows designed for their size and strength. The composite bow was a complex weapon that required years to master, and instruction began with careful attention to stance, breathing, and the coordination of eye and hand that would eventually allow a warrior to shoot accurately while riding at full gallop. Young Attila showed early promise in these skills, displaying the natural balance and keen eye that marked potential greatness among his people. But physical prowess was only one aspect of the education that prepared future leaders. Hun society valued intelligence and cunning as highly as strength and courage. Children were taught to observe carefully, to listen more than they spoke, and to think several moves ahead in the complex game of steppe politics. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated changes in weather, the health of animals, and the moods of people. Skills that could mean the difference between life and death in the harsh environment of the grasslands. Language skills were particularly important in the multicultural Hun confederation. Besides the various Hun dialects, young Attila would have learned Gothic, which served as a lingua franca among many of the Germanic peoples absorbed into the confederation. He also received instruction in Latin, the language of diplomacy and trade with the Roman Empire. This linguistic ability would later prove crucial in his dealings with Roman officials, allowing him to negotiate directly rather than relying on interpreters who might have their own agendas. The concept of honor that governed Hun society was complex and multifaceted, quite different from the simple warrior codes that Roman observers sometimes assumed. Honor could be gained through prowess in battle, but also through wise counsel, successful diplomacy, generous treatment of followers, and proper respect for the traditions of ancestors. It could be lost through cowardice, betrayal, or failure to fulfill obligations to those who depended on one's protection. Young Attila learned these distinctions through observation and practice, gradually understanding the intricate web of relationships that held Hun society together. Religious and spiritual education formed another crucial component of his upbringing. The Huns followed shamanistic traditions that recognized the presence of spirits in all aspects of the natural world. Mountains, rivers, and especially the endless sky above the steppes were seen as manifestations of divine power that could influence human affairs. Shamans served as intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds, conducting ceremonies that ensured the favor of these forces. Attila learned to respect these traditions, while also developing the practical skepticism that would later characterize his approach to political and military challenges. The young prince also received instruction in the arts of war that went far beyond individual combat skills. Hun military tactics were highly sophisticated, involving complex maneuvers that required precise coordination among hundreds or thousands of mounted warriors. These tactics were based on centuries of evolution in steppe warfare, refined through countless conflicts with other nomadic peoples, and adapted to the specific challenges of fighting settled civilizations with different military traditions. Mock battles and war games provided opportunities to practice these tactics, while also testing the leadership abilities of young nobles. Attila participated in these exercises from an early age, gradually taking on greater responsibilities as he demonstrated his ability to think clearly under pressure and inspire confidence in his followers. His natural charisma became evident during these early tests, as other young warriors began to look to him for guidance even when he was not formally in command. The economic aspects of leadership also formed part of his education. Hun society depended on a complex network of tribute, trade, and redistribution that required sophisticated understanding of political relationships across vast distances. Leaders needed to know not only how to extract wealth from subject peoples and defeated enemies, but also how to distribute it in ways that maintained the loyalty of their followers while funding future military operations. Attila learned to think in terms of long-term advantage rather than short-term gain, understanding that today's ally might become tomorrow's enemy if circumstances changed. By adolescence, Attila had begun to accompany his father on diplomatic missions and minor military expeditions, gaining first-hand experience of the wider world beyond the immediate confines of Hun territory. These journeys took him to the edges of Roman territory, where he could observe the strengths and weaknesses of the empire that dominated the settled lands to the south and west. He learned to see past the impressive facades of Roman cities and military installations, recognizing the underlying tensions and contradictions that might be exploited by a sufficiently bold and intelligent adversary. The young man who emerged from this comprehensive education was a product of his unique time and place, shaped by traditions that stretched back centuries, while facing challenges that were entirely new. He combined the physical skills of a steppe warrior with the intellectual sophistication needed to navigate the complex political landscape of 5th century Europe. He understood both the strengths of traditional Hun society and the changes that would be necessary to adapt to an evolving world. Most importantly, he had absorbed the fundamental lesson that would guide his later career. Power came not from birth or position alone, but from the to inspire others to follow where one chose to lead. In the fluid world of steppe politics, leadership was constantly tested and renewed through success. Those who could provide victory, wealth, and glory to their followers would find themselves at the head of ever-growing coalitions. Those who failed these tests would find themselves abandoned, no matter how illustrious their ancestry. As Attila approached adulthood, the stage was set for him to begin testing these lessons in the harsh arena of Hun politics. The death of his father had left questions about succession that would need to be resolved through the complex interplay of tradition, negotiation, and demonstration of fitness to lead. The young man who had been carefully prepared for this moment would soon discover whether his education had equipped him for the challenges that lay ahead. The death of Mundzuk around 415 created a succession crisis that might have shattered a less resilient society. In the traditional monarchies of the settled world, succession typically followed established laws of inheritance, with power passing automatically to the eldest son or closest male relative. But among the Huns, leadership was not a birthright to be claimed, but a responsibility to be earned through demonstration of the qualities that commanded respect among the warrior peoples of the steppes. The resolution that emerged from the complex negotiations and power struggles following Mundzuk's death reflected both the pragmatic flexibility of Hun political traditions and the particular circumstances of the early 5th century. Rather than a single heir, power would be shared between two of Mundzuk's sons, Attila and his older brother Bleda. This arrangement, known as dual kingship, had precedence in Hun history and offered several advantages during a period when the Confederation faced challenges on multiple fronts. Bleda, perhaps 5 years older than his famous brother, possessed many of the qualities valued among the Hun nobility. He was a skilled warrior and horseman, experienced in the traditional ways of steppe warfare and diplomacy. His supporters among the various tribal leaders emphasized his greater experience and his stronger connections to the traditional elements within Hun society. In their view, the Confederation needed steady leadership that would maintain the successful policies established by their father without risking dangerous innovations. Attila, though younger, had already begun to display the charismatic qualities that would later make him legendary. Even in his early 20s, he possessed an intensity of personality that made others pay attention when he spoke. His intelligence was evident to all who dealt with him, and his understanding of both Hun traditions and the wider world beyond the steppes impressed even seasoned leaders. His supporters argued that the changing times required fresh thinking and bold action that only he could provide. The compromise that elevated both brothers to joint leadership satisfied neither faction completely, but it avoided a civil war that might have destroyed Hun power at a critical moment. The arrangement divided responsibilities along traditional lines, with Bleda taking primary authority over the eastern portions of Hun territory, while Attila focused on the western regions where contact with the Roman Empire was most frequent and complex. This division of authority worked better in practice than might have been expected, largely because the two brothers complemented each other's strengths while sharing a common vision of Hun destiny. Bleda's conservative approach provided stability and continuity that reassured traditional elements within the Confederation. Attila's more innovative thinking generated new opportunities and adapted Hun strategies to changing circumstances. Together, they represented a leadership team that could appeal to different constituencies while maintaining overall unity of purpose. Their first major challenge came from an unexpected direction. The Eastern Roman Empire, governed from Constantinople by Emperor Theodosius II, had been paying tribute to the Huns for several years as part of a treaty designed to maintain peace along the Danube frontier. However, the Romans had fallen behind in their payments, either through financial difficulties or a mistaken belief that Hun power had been weakened by the succession struggles. The Roman miscalculation provided the new Hun leaders with an opportunity to establish their authority through successful military action. In 422, Attila and Bleda led their combined forces across the Danube in a campaign that would demonstrate to both their own people and their enemies that the death of Mundzuk had not weakened Hun power. The invasion was conducted with the swift precision that characterized Hun warfare at its best. Roman border fortifications, designed to resist the massed infantry assaults typical of earlier Germanic invasions, proved woefully inadequate against the fluid tactics employed by Hun cavalry. The brothers' forces bypassed strong points, struck at vulnerable targets, and disappeared before Roman reinforcements could respond. Cities that had considered themselves secure behind their walls found themselves cut off and besieged by enemies who seemed to appear from nowhere. The psychological impact of these raids often proved more devastating than the physical damage inflicted. Roman civilians, accustomed to the security provided by centuries of imperial control, found themselves face to face with an enemy that fought according to rules they did not understand. The Huns' practice of driving captive populations before them as they advanced created panic far beyond the areas they actually occupied. Refugees fled southward, carrying tales of destruction that grew more terrifying with each retelling. The Eastern Roman Empire's response revealed the limitations that would plague imperial policy throughout the Hun period. The traditional Roman military system, based on heavily equipped infantry supported by auxiliary troops, was poorly suited to combating the mobile warfare practiced by steppe peoples. Roman generals trained in the classical traditions of warfare found themselves repeatedly outmaneuvered by enemies who refused to accept battle on Roman terms. More fundamentally, the empire lacked the financial resources to maintain the large standing armies that might have been necessary to defend such an extensive frontier against Hun incursions. The economic strain of supporting both civil and military bureaucracies, combined with the declining tax base in many provinces, meant that emperors were increasingly forced to choose between expensive military solutions and less costly diplomatic arrangements. The campaign of 422 demonstrated these realities with brutal clarity. Despite their initial advantages in numbers and equipment, Roman forces proved unable to bring the Hun raiders to decisive battle. The brothers' armies struck where they chose and withdrew when they chose, leaving Roman generals to shadow their movements without ever gaining the opportunity to employ their theoretical tactical superiority. After months of this destructive warfare, Theodosius II agreed to new negotiations that would establish a framework for Hun-Roman relations for years to come. The Treaty of Margus, signed in 423, represented a diplomatic triumph for the joint kingship that established Attila and Bleda as major players in European politics. The terms reflected both the military realities demonstrated during the campaign and the sophisticated understanding of Roman weaknesses that the Hun leaders had developed. The tribute payment was not only resumed, but substantially increased, rising from £350 of gold annually to £700. This doubling of the financial burden reflected Roman recognition that Hun power had grown substantially since the original agreement had been negotiated. The gold would flow into Hun territory to fund further military expansion and to reward the warriors whose loyalty was essential to maintaining the Confederation's unity. Even more significant were the diplomatic protocols established by the treaty. The Romans agreed to receive Hun ambassadors with the same honors accorded to representatives of major powers, a recognition of status that elevated the Huns far above the position of typical barbarian tribes. In return, the Hun leaders agreed to accept formal diplomatic procedures that brought their external relations within the framework of international law as understood in the 5th century. The treaty also included provisions for the return of Hun refugees who had fled to Roman territory, a clause that would later cause significant controversy. The Romans agreed to extradite any Huns who sought sanctuary within the empire, even if they claimed to be fleeing from political persecution. This provision reflected the Hun leaders' determination to maintain absolute authority over their subjects and their understanding that allowing a sanctuary for dissidents would undermine their control. The success of the Margus negotiations enhanced the reputations of both brothers, but in different ways that reflected their distinct personalities and strengths. Bleda was credited with the military success that had forced Roman concessions, reinforcing his image as a traditional warrior leader in the mold of their ancestors. Attila received recognition for the diplomatic skill that had translated military victory into lasting political advantage, demonstrating the intellectual qualities that set him apart from conventional steppe leaders. The years following the Treaty of Margus saw the two brothers working in increasingly close cooperation as they consolidated Hun control over a vast territory stretching from the Volga to the Alps. Bleda continued to focus on the eastern regions, where his conservative approach helped maintain stability among the traditional tribal elements that formed the core of Hun society. Attila concentrated on the western frontiers, where his innovative thinking proved valuable in dealing with the complex political situation involving multiple Roman and Germanic powers. This period of joint rule allowed both brothers to develop their distinctive leadership styles while learning from each other's approaches. Bleda's emphasis on tradition and continuity provided a solid foundation for Hun power, while Attila's willingness to experiment and adapt helped the Confederation respond to changing circumstances. Together, they created a system that was both stable and dynamic, capable of maintaining internal unity while expanding external influence. The success of their partnership was reflected in the growing prosperity of Hun territory during the 420s and early 430s. Tribute from the Eastern Roman Empire provided a steady flow of gold that funded infrastructure development and military expansion. Trade relationships with various Germanic kingdoms brought in additional wealth and resources. The Confederation's military reputation ensured that potential enemies preferred negotiation to confrontation, while potential allies sought Hun protection and support. Yet beneath this surface success, tensions were beginning to develop that would eventually transform the nature of Hun leadership. Attila's growing confidence and ambition began to strain the constraints of shared power, while his innovative policies sometimes conflicted with his brother's more conservative instincts. The question of whether their partnership could survive these growing pressures would soon become central to the future of the Hun Confederation and the stability of Europe itself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Hun encampment when messengers brought word that would forever alter the course of European history. Bleda, the elder brother, who had shared power with Attila for more than a decade, was dead. The official account spoke of a hunting accident, a moment of carelessness that had cost the life of one of the most powerful men in the known world. But in the whispered conversations that followed, darker possibilities circulated among the tents and yurts of the Hun Confederation. The exact circumstances of Bleda's death in 445 remain shrouded in mystery that has never been fully penetrated by historical scholarship. Contemporary sources, both Roman and Hun, provide conflicting accounts that reflect the political complexities surrounding the event. What cannot be disputed is that Attila emerged from his brother's death as the sole ruler of the Hun Confederation, a position that concentrated unprecedented power in the hands of a single individual. Some accounts suggest that the brothers had grown increasingly distant in recent years, their different approaches to leadership creating tensions that were no longer easily reconciled through compromise and negotiation. Bleda's conservative instincts had served the Confederation well during the early years of their joint rule, but Attila's supporters argued that changing circumstances required bolder action that the older brother was reluctant to authorize. The division of authority that had worked effectively when both brothers were content with their respective spheres of influence, became more problematic as Attila's ambitions expanded beyond the western territories originally assigned to him. His success in dealing with Roman diplomats and Germanic leaders had enhanced his reputation throughout the Confederation, attracting followers who saw him as the leader most capable of maximizing Hun advantages in an evolving political landscape. These growing tensions came to a head over questions of military policy that touched on fundamental questions about the future direction of Hun society. Bleda favored the traditional approach of extracting tribute from settled peoples while maintaining the nomadic lifestyle that had sustained their ancestors for generations. Attila envisioned a more aggressive policy that would transform the Huns from raiders and tribute collectors into the dominant power in European politics. The catalyst for the final crisis may have been a dispute over the distribution of tribute payments from the Eastern Roman Empire. The gold that flowed into Hun territory was not merely a source of wealth, but the foundation of the political relationships that held the Confederation together. Leaders maintained their positions partly through their ability to reward followers with shares of this tribute, and any change in distribution arrangements inevitably created winners and losers among the various tribal chiefs and war leaders. Attila's growing influence had attracted supporters who expected to benefit from his rise to supreme power, while Bleda's traditional allies had reason to fear that their positions might be diminished under a new arrangement. The question of succession, which had been temporarily resolved through joint kingship, reasserted itself as the brothers found it increasingly difficult to maintain unified policies across their respective territories. Whether Bleda's death was truly accidental, or whether it resulted from a more deliberate decision by his ambitious younger brother, the immediate aftermath demonstrated Attila's political skill and ruthless efficiency. Rather than allowing the succession question to develop into a destructive civil war, he moved swiftly to consolidate his position and neutralize potential opponents, while presenting himself as the natural heir to the unified authority that both brothers had previously shared. His first priority was securing the loyalty of the military leaders, whose support would be essential to maintaining order during the transition. Hun warfare depended on the personal relationships between commanders and their followers, and any suggestion of weakness or division at the top could quickly cascade into the fragmentation of the entire confederation. Attila's reputation as a successful war leader served him well in this crucial period, as did his careful cultivation of relationships with key figures over many years. The tribal chiefs who had supported Bleda found themselves faced with a choice between resistance and accommodation. Resistance carried the risk of being branded as traitors to Hun unity, a dangerous position when Attila controlled the loyalty of a significant portion of the Confederation's military forces. Accommodation offered the possibility of maintaining their positions under the new regime, albeit with reduced influence than they had enjoyed under the dual kingship. Most chose accommodation, recognizing both the futility of resistance and the potential advantages of supporting a leader whose ambitious vision might create new opportunities for wealth and glory. Attila reinforced these calculations through a combination of generous rewards for early supporters and subtle threats against those who might be contemplating opposition. The distribution of Bleda's personal wealth among key followers helped cement their loyalty, while demonstrating that the new sole ruler intended to honor traditional Hun customs regarding the treatment of a dead leader's possessions. The speed and efficiency with which Attila consolidated his power surprised even those who knew him well. Within weeks of his brother's death, he had transformed what might have been a dangerous succession crisis into a smooth transition that actually strengthened the Confederation's unity and coherence. The political skills that he had developed during years of shared leadership proved equal to the challenge of managing the complex relationships that held Hun society together. His first major decision as sole ruler was to reorganize the military structure in ways that reflected his strategic vision for the Confederation's future. The traditional system of tribal war bands, while effective for raiding and small-scale conflicts, was inadequate for the large-scale campaigns that Attila envisioned. He began implementing reforms that would create a more centralized command structure capable of coordinating the movements of armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. These military reforms were accompanied by changes in diplomatic policy that signaled a more aggressive approach to relations with the Roman Empire and other neighboring powers. Where the dual kingship had often been content to extract tribute and maintain existing agreements, Attila began probing for weaknesses that might be exploited to expand Hun influence and control. His ambassadors adopted a more demanding tone in their negotiations, backed by the implicit threat of military action if their terms were not accepted. The transformation in Hun policy became apparent in the renewed negotiations with the Eastern Roman Empire that followed Attila's consolidation of power. The tribute arrangements established under the Treaty of Margus had provided a substantial source of revenue, but Attila's expanded ambitions required even greater financial resources. His demands for increased payments were accompanied by new territorial claims that would have extended Hun control deep into traditional Roman provinces. Emperor Theodosius II found himself facing a more formidable adversary than he had dealt with during the period of joint Hun leadership. Attila's negotiating style combined intellectual sophistication with barely contained aggression in ways that made clear the consequences of Roman refusal to meet his demands. The young Hun leader demonstrated an intimate knowledge of Roman internal politics and military capabilities that enabled him to exploit weaknesses with devastating effectiveness. The diplomatic revolution that accompanied Attila's rise to sole power extended beyond his dealings with Constantinople. Germanic kingdoms that had previously felt secure in their relationships with the Hun Confederation found themselves facing new demands for tribute and submission. Slavic tribes along the northern frontiers of Hun territory discovered that their traditional autonomy was no longer acceptable to a leader whose vision encompassed direct control over vast territories. These expanding demands were backed by military capabilities that had grown substantially during the years of Attila's rise to power. The reforms he had begun implementing created armies that were larger, better organized, and more strategically focused than anything the Huns had previously deployed. His personal charisma and reputation for invincibility attracted warriors from throughout the barbarian world, men who abandoned their traditional loyalties to serve under a leader whose success seemed guaranteed. The transformation of Attila from joint ruler to sole autocrat represented more than a simple change in leadership structure. It marked the evolution of the Hun Confederation from a traditional steppe society into something approaching a centralized state, organized around the will and vision of a single, extraordinary individual. This transformation would have profound consequences not only for the Huns themselves, but for the entire balance of power in 5th century Europe. The death of Bleda had removed the last significant constraint on Attila's ambitions, but it had also placed the entire burden of leadership on his shoulders alone. The success or failure of the Hun Confederation would now depend on his personal abilities and decisions. The stage was set for the most destructive and dramatic period in the long history of Hun relations with the civilized world, as Attila prepared to test his strength against the greatest power of his age. The year 447 dawned with omens that seemed to foretell catastrophe for the Eastern Roman Empire. Earthquakes shook Constantinople, toppling sections of the great walls that had protected the city for generations, and killing thousands in the collapse of buildings throughout the capital. Plague followed in the wake of the seismic disasters, weakening the empire's ability to respond to external threats, just as the most dangerous enemy in its history was preparing to strike. Attila viewed these natural disasters not as random misfortunes, but as signs that the time had come to test his strength against the mightiest fortress of the civilized world. The consolidation of his power following Bleda's death had taken 2 years of careful planning and preparation, but now he commanded resources that dwarfed anything his predecessors had ever assembled. The army that gathered on the plains north of the Danube in the spring of 447 represented the largest military force that the barbarian world had ever produced. Contemporary accounts, though certainly exaggerated by the terror of those who witnessed the invasion, describe Hun forces that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Beyond the traditional Hun cavalry that formed the core of Attila's power, his army included Germanic warriors from dozens of subject tribes, Slavic infantry from the northern forests, and Alan horsemen from the steppes beyond the Don River. This was not merely a raiding party or tribal migration, but a coordinated military campaign designed to break the power of the Eastern Roman Empire once and for all. The strategic planning that preceded the invasion revealed the sophisticated military thinking that distinguished Attila from earlier barbarian leaders. Rather than simply crossing the Danube and pillaging whatever territories lay within reach, he had developed a comprehensive campaign designed to systematically destroy the empire's ability to resist Hun dominance. His intelligence network had provided detailed information about Roman defensive preparations, troop dispositions, and the internal political tensions that might be exploited during the coming conflict. The Hun army crossed the Danube at multiple points simultaneously, a maneuver that prevented Roman forces from concentrating against any single threat, while creating panic across a front that stretched for hundreds of miles. The great fortress cities that had anchored Roman defense for generations found themselves bypassed and isolated as Hun cavalry swept around them like water flowing around stones. Marcianopolis, Philippopolis, and Arcadiopolis, strongholds that had never fallen to barbarian assault, watched helplessly as enemy forces passed beneath their walls without pause. Attila's strategy reflected his understanding that the true strength of the Roman Empire lay not in its fortifications, but in its economic and administrative infrastructure. Rather than wasting time and lives in costly sieges, his forces targeted the roads, bridges, aqueducts, and administrative centers that made Roman civilization possible. Tax collectors, postal stations, and local officials became priority targets in a campaign designed to sever the connections that held the empire together. The psychological warfare that accompanied the physical destruction proved equally devastating to Roman morale. Hun mounted archers appeared suddenly in regions that had not seen warfare for generations, striking at undefended villages and estates before vanishing into the landscape. The smoke from burning villas and granaries could be seen from the walls of Constantinople itself, a constant reminder that the empire's heartland was no longer secure against barbarian attack. Roman field armies that attempted to intercept the Hun raiders discovered the futility of conventional tactics against Attila's mobile forces. Time and again, Roman generals found themselves chasing shadows, arriving at reported battle sites to find only the smoking ruins of destroyed settlements and the tracks of horses leading in every direction. When they did succeed in bringing Hun forces to battle, they faced enemies who fought according to unfamiliar rules that neutralized traditional Roman advantages in discipline and equipment. The siege of Naissus provided a particularly dramatic example of how Hun warfare had evolved beyond simple raiding. The city, located at a strategic crossroads in the central Balkans, was strongly fortified and garrisoned by some of the best troops available to the Eastern Empire. Its walls had never been breached by barbarian assault, and its defenders initially confident that they could withstand any siege that Attila might mount. What they had not anticipated was the sophisticated siegecraft that the Huns had developed through decades of warfare against fortified positions. Attila's engineers, many of whom had learned their skills in Roman service before defecting to the Hun cause, deployed siege engines that rivaled anything in the imperial arsenal. Battering rams, catapults, and scaling towers appeared outside the city's walls with a speed that astounded the defenders. The psychological pressure of the siege proved as devastating as the physical assault. Hun shamans conducted rituals that were designed to be visible from the city walls, calling upon supernatural forces to aid in the destruction of Roman power. The constant sound of drums and war cries from the besieging army created an atmosphere of dread that undermined the defenders' morale even before the final assault began. When Naissus finally fell after weeks of siege, the fate of its population sent shockwaves throughout the Eastern Empire. Rather than simply looting the city and departing, Attila ordered its complete destruction as an example to other communities that might consider resistance. The massacre that followed was systematic and thorough, designed to demonstrate the consequences of defying Hun authority. The The destruction of Naissus marked a turning point in the campaign, as other fortified cities began surrendering without resistance rather than facing similar annihilation. Serdica, Philippopolis, and dozens of smaller towns opened their gates to Hun forces, hoping that submission might spare them the fate that had befallen the stubborn defenders of Naissus. The psychological effect of these surrenders accelerated the collapse of Roman resistance throughout the Balkans. By the autumn of 447, Hun forces had advanced to within sight of Constantinople itself. The great walls of the capital, hastily repaired after the earthquake damage earlier in the year, presented a formidable obstacle to any conventional assault. But Attila's strategy did not require the capture of Constantinople to achieve his objectives. The systematic destruction of the provinces that supported the capital had already accomplished much of what he had set out to achieve. Emperor Theodosius II, faced with the collapse of his Balkan defences and the appearance of Hun cavalry in the suburbs of his capital, found himself with few options other than negotiation. The terms that Attila demanded reflected both his military success and his sophisticated understanding of Roman weaknesses. The tribute payments that had previously amounted to £700 of gold annually would be tripled to £2,100, an enormous burden that would strain the empire's finances for years to come. Even more humiliating were the diplomatic concessions that Attila extracted from the desperate emperor. Roman officials would be required to treat Hun ambassadors as equals to the highest imperial ministers, a recognition of status that elevated the barbarian confederation to the level of a major power. The Romans also agreed to cede a strip of territory south of the Danube that would serve as a buffer zone under direct Hun control, the first formal territorial concession that the Eastern Empire had made to barbarian demands. The most controversial provision of the new treaty involved the extradition of Romans who had defected to Hun service and subsequently fled back to imperial territory. Many of these men had provided Attila with valuable intelligence about Roman military capabilities and defensive preparations. The emperor's agreement to return them to Hun justice was seen by many as a betrayal of Roman citizens who had fallen into disfavor with the barbarian king. The execution of these extradited Romans provided Attila with an opportunity to demonstrate both his justice and his ruthlessness to audiences on both sides of the imperial frontier. Some defectors who had provided valuable service were pardoned and restored to positions of honor within the Hun Confederation. Others, particularly those who had attempted to play both sides or who had provided false information, faced public execution as traitors to their adopted cause. The success of the 447 campaign established Attila as the dominant figure in European politics, feared by enemies and courted by potential allies throughout the known world. The tribute flowing from Constantinople provided resources for further military expansion, while the territorial concessions gave him secure bases from which to launch future operations. Most importantly, the campaign had demonstrated that even the mightiest fortifications and most disciplined armies of the civilized world could not stand against the coordinated assault of the Hun Confederation under his leadership. Yet even as he celebrated this triumph, Attila was already turning his attention to new challenges and opportunities. The Eastern Roman Empire, though defeated and humiliated, had not been destroyed. Its administrative structure remained largely intact, and its financial resources, while strained by the massive tribute payments, were still sufficient to support future resistance. The campaign had been a stunning success, but it was only the first act in a larger drama that would determine the future balance of power between the barbarian and civilized worlds. The victory over the Eastern Empire also created new strategic possibilities that Attila was quick to recognize. The Western Roman Empire, traditionally the weaker of the two halves of the Roman world, might prove more vulnerable to the kind of pressure that had forced Constantinople to submit. The Visigothic kingdom in Gaul, the Vandal territories in North Africa, and the various Germanic kingdoms scattered throughout former Roman provinces all represented potential targets for future expansion. The stage was being set for conflicts that would dwarf even the great campaign of 447, as Attila prepared to test his strength against new enemies and in new theaters of war. The boy who had learned to ride and shoot on the endless steppes of Central Asia had become the master of European politics, but his greatest challenges still lay ahead. The gold that flowed from Constantinople's treasury into Hun coffers in the years following 447 transformed more than just the material circumstances of Attila's confederation. The massive tribute payments, extracted through military success and diplomatic pressure, provided resources that enabled the Hun leader to think beyond the traditional goals of steppe warfare. Where his predecessors had been content to raid and withdraw, Attila began to envision a permanent transformation of the European political landscape, with himself as the dominant figure. The Eastern Roman Empire, though humbled by his great campaign, had proven resilient enough to meet his tribute demands and maintain its basic governmental structure. This very resilience, however, suggested that further expansion in that direction might encounter diminishing returns. The wealth needed to support ever larger armies was flowing steadily from Constantinople, but the political and military objectives that might justify another Eastern campaign were less clear than they had been in 447. Attila's attention therefore began to turn westward, toward the territories controlled by the Western Roman Empire and its various Germanic allies and competitors. This shift in strategic focus reflected not only the practical considerations of where the greatest opportunities for conquest might lie, but also a fundamental evolution in his understanding of his own historical role and destiny. The Western Empire presented a different set of challenges and opportunities than its Eastern counterpart. While Constantinople remained the undisputed center of Eastern Roman power, the West was characterized by a complex web of relationships between the imperial government in Ravenna, powerful Germanic kingdoms that had established themselves within former Roman territories, and a Roman military establishment that was increasingly dependent on barbarian allies and mercenaries for its effectiveness. This political fragmentation created possibilities for the kind of diplomatic manipulation at which Attila excelled. Where a unified enemy might present a solid front against Hun expansion, the competing interests and mutual suspicions among Western powers offered opportunities for the clever exploitation of divisions and contradictions. The Hun leader's intelligence network had provided him with detailed knowledge of these tensions, and he was prepared to use this information to maximum advantage. The immediate catalyst for Attila's westward expansion was a crisis involving the Vandal kingdom in North Africa and its relationship with both the Western Empire and the Visigothic kingdom in southwestern Gaul. King Genseric of the Vandals, one of the most successful Germanic leaders of his generation, had established his people as the dominant naval power in the western Mediterranean through a combination of piracy, conquest, and skillful diplomacy. Genseric's success had created alarm in Ravenna, where the Western Emperor Valentinian III and his powerful general Aetius were struggling to maintain imperial authority in the face of multiple barbarian threats. The loss of North African tax revenues to Vandal control had severely damaged the empire's financial position, while Vandal naval raids on Italy itself demonstrated the vulnerability of territories that had once seemed secure behind Roman defenses. The Visigothic kingdom, meanwhile, had its own reasons for concern about Vandal expansion. King Theodoric I had established his people as the dominant power in southwestern Gaul, but his position depended on maintaining a delicate balance between cooperation and competition with Roman authorities. Vandal success in North Africa threatened to upset this balance by demonstrating that Germanic kingdoms could challenge Roman power with impunity. Into this complex situation, Attila inserted himself with the diplomatic skill that had become his trademark. Rather than simply choosing one side or another in the developing conflict, he began playing all parties against each other while positioning himself as the ultimate arbiter of Western European politics. His ambassadors appeared simultaneously in Ravenna, Toulouse, and Carthage, offering alliance to each power while extracting concessions that strengthened Hun influence throughout the region. The negotiations that followed revealed the extent to which Attila had mastered the arts of diplomacy and political manipulation. To the Romans, he presented himself as a potential ally against the growing threat of Vandal and Visigothic expansion. To the Visigoths, he offered partnership in limiting Roman power while containing Vandal ambitions. To the Vandals, he suggested cooperation in the final destruction of Roman authority in the West. Each set of negotiations was carefully calibrated to extract maximum advantage while avoiding commitments that might limit his future freedom of action. The Romans were encouraged to provide tribute and territorial concessions in exchange for Hun neutrality in their conflicts with other barbarian powers. The Visigoths were offered military support against their enemies in return for recognition of Hun supremacy and regular tribute payments. The Vandals were promised assistance in their naval campaigns in exchange for a share of their plunder and acknowledgement of Attila's authority over land-based operations. The complexity of these diplomatic arrangements required unprecedented administrative sophistication from the Hun Confederation. Where traditional steppe societies had been organized around personal relationships and oral agreements, Attila's expanding empire demanded written treaties, permanent diplomatic representatives, and bureaucratic structures capable of managing multiple simultaneous negotiations across vast distances. The development of this administrative apparatus marked another stage in the transformation of Hun society from its nomadic origins toward something resembling a conventional state. Attila surrounded himself with advisors and administrators drawn from the various peoples that had been incorporated into his confederation, creating a multicultural government that could effectively deal with the diverse challenges of ruling a vast and heterogeneous empire. Among his most important advisors were Romans who had defected to Hun service, bringing with them intimate knowledge of imperial administrative and military practices. These men provided insights that enabled Attila to exploit Roman weaknesses while avoiding the mistakes that had led to the downfall of earlier barbarian leaders. Their expertise in law, finance, and diplomacy gave the Hun court a sophistication that rivaled the imperial chancelleries of Constantinople and Ravenna. The military preparations that accompanied Attila's diplomatic offensive demonstrated the resources that his earlier successes had placed at his disposal. The armies that began assembling in Hun territory during the late 400s, 40s dwarfed even the great host that had devastated the Balkans in 447. Warriors flocked to his banners from throughout the barbarian world, attracted by his reputation for invincibility and the promise of rich plunder from the wealthy cities of Gaul and Italy. The logistical challenges of supporting such vast forces required innovations that pushed the traditional practices of steppe warfare to their limits. Hun society had always been mobile, but the armies that Attila was assembling were too large to live off the land in the traditional manner. Extensive supply trains, organized bases of operations, and systematic foraging procedures became necessary to maintain military effectiveness during extended campaigns in unfamiliar territories. These preparations did not go unnoticed by Roman observers, who began reporting the movement of large Hun forces toward the western frontiers of their territory. The intelligence that reached Ravenna painted an alarming picture of military preparations on a scale that had never before been attempted by barbarian forces. Estimates of Hun strength varied wildly, but even the most conservative assessments suggested that Attila could field armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The Roman response to these threatening preparations revealed the limitations that had come to characterize the Western Empire's military capabilities. Emperor Valentinian III was still a young man, but effective power rested in the hands of his general Aetius, who had built his career on the successful management of barbarian relationships rather than the direct confrontation of barbarian armies. Aetius understood that the empire lacked the resources to meet a full-scale Hun invasion with the purely Roman forces, but his attempts to organize an effective coalition of allies faced obstacles that reflected the fragmented nature of Western European politics. The Visigothic kingdom, despite its own concerns about Hun expansion, was reluctant to commit fully to an alliance with Rome, given the history of conflict between the two powers. King Theodoric I had spent years establishing his independence from Roman control, and he was understandably suspicious of any arrangement that might restore imperial authority over his territories. Similar considerations influenced the decisions of other Germanic leaders, who might theoretically have been natural allies against Hun expansion. The diplomatic and military chess game that developed during 450 and 451 involved moves and countermoves of extraordinary complexity as Attila sought to maximize his advantages while his potential enemies struggled to coordinate an effective response. The Hun leader's strategy was designed to isolate his enemies and prevent the formation of an effective coalition against him, while his opponents sought to overcome their mutual suspicions long enough to present a united front against the common threat. The stakes of this confrontation extended far beyond the immediate territorial and political questions at issue. The outcome would determine whether the Roman Empire, despite its internal weaknesses and external pressures, could survive as a significant force in European politics. It would also test whether the various Germanic kingdoms that had established themselves within former Roman territories could maintain their independence against the expanding power of the Hun Confederation. Most fundamentally, the developing conflict would determine whether the future of European civilization would be shaped by the traditions and institutions inherited from the classical world, or by the very different values and practices of the steppe peoples who had emerged from the Asian heartland to challenge the dominance of Rome. The stage was being set for one of the decisive confrontations in the history of the Western world. The spring of 451 arrived with an air of inevitable conflict that settled over Western Europe like morning mist across a battlefield. In the territories controlled by the Hun Confederation, the largest army in barbarian history was completing its final preparations for a campaign that would determine the future of Roman civilization. Across the Rhine and throughout Gaul, desperate diplomatic efforts continued as Roman officials and Germanic leaders sought to forge an alliance strong enough to resist the coming storm. Attila's invasion route through modern-day Germany and into Gaul followed patterns that had been established by Germanic migrations over the previous century, but the scale and organization of his forces transformed what might have been another tribal movement into something resembling the great military campaigns of classical antiquity. Contemporary estimates, though certainly inflated by the terror of those who witnessed the advance, describe Hun armies that stretched across the landscape like a moving sea of warriors, their passage marked by clouds of dust that could be seen from days away. The composition of Attila's forces reflected the extraordinary political achievement he had accomplished in uniting the barbarian peoples of Central and Eastern Europe under his leadership. The core of his army consisted of Hun cavalry, the swift mounted archers whose military techniques had evolved through centuries of steppe warfare. These warriors formed the elite units that would determine the outcome of any major engagement, their mobility and firepower giving Attila tactical advantages that no enemy had yet learned to counter effectively. Supporting the Hun cavalry were Germanic infantry units drawn from dozens of subject tribes and allied kingdoms. Ostrogoths, Gepids, Rugians, and many smaller peoples had contributed warriors to the great host, their participation secured through a combination of tributary obligations, shared plunder expectations, and genuine admiration for Attila's leadership. These infantry formations provided the staying power needed for extended campaigns and siege operations, complementing the mobility of the Hun cavalry with discipline and endurance in conventional combat. The baggage trains that followed this vast army represented an achievement in military logistics that had few precedents in barbarian warfare. Traditional steppe armies lived off their herds and whatever plunder they could extract from conquered territories, but Attila's forces were too large and their objectives too ambitious for such primitive supply methods. Organized foraging, systematic requisitions from allied territories, and elaborate transportation networks became necessary to maintain military effectiveness during the extended campaign that lay ahead. The psychological impact of this military machine's advance across the Rhine and into Gaul cannot be understated. Cities that had considered themselves secure behind Roman defenses for generations found themselves facing an enemy whose reputation had grown to almost mythological proportions. Stories of the destruction that had befallen Naissus and other Balkan cities spread terror far beyond the territories actually threatened by Hun forces, creating panic that weakened resistance before any battle had been fought. Metz, one of the first major cities to lie in Attila's path, fell after a brief siege that demonstrated both the effectiveness of Hun siege techniques and the demoralization of Gallic defenders. The systematic destruction that followed sent a clear message to other communities about the consequences of resistance, while the treatment of prisoners provided intelligence about Roman defensive preparations throughout the region. As Hun forces advanced deeper into Gaul, the desperate diplomatic efforts that had been underway throughout the winter finally began to bear fruit. Aetius, the Roman general who had spent decades managing barbarian relationships, succeeded in forging an alliance that brought together former enemies in the face of the common threat posed by Attila's invasion. The Visigothic king Theodoric I agreed to march with Roman forces, setting aside years of conflict in recognition that Hun victory would threaten his kingdom's independence as much as Roman authority. The coalition that assembled to face Attila represented one of the most remarkable diplomatic achievements of the late imperial period. Romans and Visigoths, who had fought each other repeatedly over the previous decades, now found themselves standing together against an enemy that threatened to destroy both of their civilizations. Burgundians, Franks, Alans, and other Germanic peoples contributed forces to the allied army, creating a military force that was nearly as diverse in its composition as Attila's own confederation. The Roman and allied forces that marched to confront the Hun invasion were commanded by men who understood that the fate of their entire way of life depended on the outcome of the coming battle. Aetius had built his career on his ability to manage barbarian threats through diplomacy and limited military action, but he recognized that Attila's ambitions could not be satisfied through negotiation. King Theodoric brought with him the military traditions of his people, warrior skills that had been honed through generations of conflict on the frontiers of the Roman world. The strategic situation that developed as the two armies approached each other near the city of Chalons reflected the culmination of political and military trends that had been building for decades. The Hun Confederation represented the ultimate expression of steppe military power, organized under the leadership of a single extraordinary individual whose vision encompassed the transformation of European politics. The Roman-Germanic alliance represented the last effective resistance of the settled civilizations of the West, united in desperate defense of their survival. The exact location of the battlefield that would determine the outcome of this great confrontation remains a matter of scholarly debate, but contemporary sources agree that it lay on the vast plains near Châlons-en-Champagne, terrain that favored the mobility of Hun cavalry while providing sufficient space for the deployment of the massive armies that both sides had assembled. The ground itself seemed to echo with the weight of history as forces representing two different civilizations prepared for what many believed would be the decisive battle of their age. The night before the battle, both armies made their final preparations in ways that reflected their different traditions and expectations. In the Hun camp, shamans conducted rituals designed to secure the favor of the sky god and the spirits of the steppes, while Attila himself moved among his warriors, his presence serving to remind them of the victories that had brought them to this moment of destiny. The Roman and allied camps echoed with Christian prayers and the more ancient invocations of Germanic war gods, as men who had rarely fought together prepared to stand as brothers against their common enemy. When dawn broke on that fateful day in late June 451, it illuminated one of the largest battlefields in ancient history. Estimates of the total forces involved range from the hundreds of thousands claimed by contemporary chroniclers to the more modest but still enormous numbers suggested by modern historians. What cannot be disputed is that the armies facing each other across the Catalaunian plains represented the largest concentration of military power that Europe had seen since the great campaigns of the classical period. The battle itself unfolded with a complexity that reflected both the sophisticated military techniques available to 5th-century commanders and the enormous scale of the forces involved. Attila's initial strategy focused on using his cavalry superiority to break the cohesion of the Allied line, counting on the mobility and archery skills of his Hun warriors to create opportunities that could be exploited by his Germanic infantry. The Roman and Visigothic response demonstrated the military lessons that had been learned through decades of conflict with barbarian enemies. Rather than presenting a static defensive line that could be outmaneuvered by Hun cavalry, Aetius and Theodoric deployed their forces in a flexible formation that could respond to attacks from multiple directions while maintaining overall cohesion. The fighting that followed was characterized by a series of cavalry charges and infantry counterattacks that produced casualties on a scale that shocked even experienced warriors accustomed to the brutality of barbarian warfare. King Theodoric himself fell in the midst of the battle, his death serving to inflame Visigothic resistance rather than break their morale, as Attila might have hoped. The loss of this experienced leader was balanced by the inspiration his sacrifice provided to his followers, who fought with the desperation of men defending not just territory, but their entire way of life. As the day wore on, it became apparent that neither side could achieve the decisive victory that their leaders had envisioned. Hun cavalry charges that might have shattered less determined opponents found themselves blocked by disciplined infantry formations that bent but did not break under the assault. Allied counterattacks that should have swept away barbarian resistance encountered Hun reserves that appeared with the speed and precision that characterized steppe warfare at its best. By evening, when the exhaustion of both armies finally brought the fighting to an end, the battlefield presented a scene of carnage that would be remembered for generations. Contemporary accounts describe fields covered with the bodies of warriors from dozens of different peoples, their blood mingling in soil that had been transformed into mud by the scale of the slaughter. The survivors on both sides had gained a new understanding of the price that would be paid for dominance over the future of European civilization. The aftermath of the battle saw both armies withdraw to assess their losses and consider their options for future action. Attila, denied the crushing victory that might have opened the road to Rome itself, found himself facing the unfamiliar experience of strategic defeat despite tactical success. His forces remained formidable, but the resilience of the Roman-Germanic alliance had demonstrated that his advance could be contested by determined opposition. The Roman and Allied leaders, while celebrating their success in halting Hun expansion, recognized that they had achieved a defensive victory rather than the decisive triumph that would have ended the threat permanently. Attila's army remained intact, and his strategic objectives had been delayed rather than abandoned. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains had saved Western civilizations from immediate conquest, but it had not resolved the fundamental challenge posed by Hun power under Attila's leadership. The autumn of 451 found Attila in his winter quarters beyond the Rhine, contemplating the lessons of the great battle that had failed to achieve the decisive victory he had envisioned. The Catalaunian plains had demonstrated both the heights of his military achievement and the limits of even his extraordinary power. Yet rather than accepting this setback as a permanent constraint on his ambitions, the Hun leader began planning a campaign that would test Roman resolve in the very heart of the empire itself. The strategic logic that led Attila toward Italy was compelling in its simplicity. The Western Roman Empire had survived his Gallic campaign by assembling a coalition that included their most dangerous barbarian enemies, transforming potential Hun allies into determined opponents. A direct assault on Italy would force the Romans to defend their homeland with whatever resources they could muster, while simultaneously demonstrating to potential allies and enemies throughout Europe that Hun power remained undiminished despite the setbacks in Gaul. The political situation in Italy during the winter of 451 to 452 provided additional incentives for Attila's bold decision. Emperor Valentinian III, still young and increasingly dependent on others for effective governance, had been struggling with internal challenges that weakened the empire's ability to respond to external threats. The relationship between the emperor and his powerful general Aetius had grown strained following the Gallic campaign, as court factions sought to exploit military success for their own political advantage. More immediately relevant to Attila's calculations was a complex dynastic dispute that offered him a pretext for intervention in imperial affairs. Honoria, the emperor's sister, had become embroiled in a scandal involving an unauthorized love affair that had resulted in her virtual imprisonment within the imperial palace. In desperation, she had sent secret messages to Attila offering to marry him in exchange for his assistance in claiming what she argued was her rightful share of imperial authority. Whether Honoria's proposal represented a genuine political opportunity or merely a convenient excuse for invasion remains a matter of historical debate. What cannot be questioned is that Attila seized upon her offer as justification for claims to imperial territory that went far beyond anything he had previously demanded. By accepting Honoria as his bride, he argued, he would become a legitimate member of the imperial family with rights that could be enforced through military action if necessary. The diplomatic exchanges that preceded the invasion revealed Attila's sophisticated understanding of Roman law and political traditions. His ambassadors presented his claims in language that drew upon imperial precedents and constitutional principles, demonstrating that the Hun leader had mastered the legal as well as military aspects of his challenge to Roman authority. The demand for Honoria's hand in marriage was accompanied by claims to half of the Western Empire as her dowry, a demand so extraordinary that it could only be interpreted as a declaration of war. Valentinian III's response to these demands reflected both the impossibility of accepting them and the limited options available to the imperial government. The marriage proposal was rejected as an insult to imperial dignity, while the territorial claims were dismissed as the ravings of a barbarian chief who had overestimated his own importance. Yet the tone of the Roman reply suggested an underlying recognition that Attila possessed the power to enforce his demands through military action that the empire might be unable to resist. The spring of 452 brought confirmatory reports that Hun forces were once again on the march, this time directing their advance toward the Alpine passes that guarded the approaches to northern Italy. The army that Attila had assembled for his Italian campaign was smaller than the great host that had invaded Gaul, but it was also more focused in its objectives and more experienced in the sophisticated siege techniques that would be necessary for the conquest of fortified cities. The passage of the Alps, that great natural barrier that had protected Italy from northern invasions since the campaigns of Hannibal, proved no more effective against Hun mobility than the Danube had been in earlier campaigns. Attila's scouts had identified several passes that could accommodate his cavalry and baggage trains, while his advance guard moved swiftly to secure these routes before Roman defenders could block them effectively. The first Italian city to feel the weight of Hun assault was Aquileia, the great fortress that guarded the northeastern approach to the peninsula. This ancient city had been founded as a Roman colony in the 2nd century BC and had grown to become one of the most important commercial and military centers in the region. Its massive walls and experienced garrison represented exactly the kind of challenge that had previously deterred barbarian invasions of Italy. The siege of Aquileia became a test of the sophisticated military techniques that Attila had developed through decades of warfare against fortified positions. Hun engineers, many of whom had learned their skills in Roman service before defecting to the barbarian cause, deployed siege engines that rivaled anything in the imperial arsenal. The city's defenders found themselves facing an enemy whose knowledge of Roman military engineering enabled them to exploit weaknesses that less sophisticated opponents might never have discovered. The psychological pressure of the siege proved as devastating as the physical assault on the city's fortifications. Stories of the fate that had befallen cities that had resisted Hun forces in previous campaigns spread terror among the civilian population, while the constant sound of siege engines and the smoke from burning suburbs created an atmosphere of impending doom that undermined defensive morale. When Aquileia finally fell after a siege that lasted several months, the destruction that followed sent shockwaves throughout northern Italy. The city was not merely captured and looted, but systematically destroyed in ways that ensured it would never again serve as a barrier to invasion from the north. Buildings were torn down, fortifications were dismantled, and the population was either killed or enslaved in a demonstration of Hun ruthlessness that was designed to discourage resistance from other cities. The psychological impact of Aquileia's destruction opened the way for rapid Hun advances throughout the Po Valley. Milan, Pavia, and a dozen smaller cities surrendered without resistance rather than facing the fate that had befallen the great fortress city. The speed of these surrenders allowed Attila to advance toward the heart of Italy with a momentum that caught Roman defenders off guard and left them scrambling to organize effective resistance. As Hun forces moved deeper into Italy, approaching the traditional boundaries that separated northern Italy from the Roman heartland around the capital, Emperor Valentinian III found himself facing the most serious crisis of his reign. The army that had fought successfully in Gaul was still recovering from its losses in that campaign and could not be rapidly redeployed to defend Italy. The Germanic allies, who had proven crucial to Roman success at the Catalaunian plains, were concerned primarily with defending their own territories and showed little inclination to march to Italy's defense. In this desperate situation, Valentinian turned to the one institution that retained both moral authority and practical influence throughout the Western Empire: the Christian Church. Pope Leo I, who had already established himself as one of the most effective leaders of his generation, agreed to undertake a diplomatic mission that would test whether spiritual authority could accomplish what military force had failed to achieve. The meeting between Attila and Pope Leo that took place near Mantua in the summer of 452 represents one of the most dramatic encounters in the history of European civilization. Contemporary accounts, colored by Christian interpretation and Hun legend, provide conflicting versions of what transpired during their negotiations. What seems certain is that Leo presented arguments that combined appeals to mercy with warnings about the consequences of attacking the center of the Christian world. The papal embassy's success in persuading Attila to withdraw from Italy without attacking Rome itself has puzzled historians for centuries. Various explanations have been proposed, ranging from divine intervention claimed by Christian sources to more practical considerations involving Hun logistics and Roman diplomacy. The reality was probably a combination of factors that made continued advance less attractive than strategic withdrawal. Plague and disease had begun to affect Hun forces during their extended campaign in Italy, problems that were exacerbated by the unfamiliar climate and the challenges of maintaining supply lines across the Alps. The prospect of a lengthy siege of Rome, which would have been necessary to complete the conquest of the peninsula, may have seemed less appealing when balanced against the costs in men and time that such an operation would require. More importantly, intelligence reports reaching Attila indicated that the Eastern Roman Empire was taking advantage of his absence to renege on tribute payments and prepare military operations against Hun territory. The prospect of fighting a two-front war while his best forces were committed to the Italian campaign may have convinced the Hun leader that strategic withdrawal was preferable to the complete conquest that had seemed within his grasp. The terms of Attila's withdrawal from Italy reflected both his military success and the practical limitations that had prevented him from achieving his maximum objectives. Substantial tribute payments and diplomatic concessions were extracted from the imperial government, while the psychological impact of the campaign established Hun power as the dominant force in European politics. Rome itself had been spared, but the Western Empire's inability to defend its heartland had been exposed for all to see. The Hun withdrawal from Italy was conducted with the same systematic efficiency that had characterized the invasion, demonstrating the discipline and organization that distinguished Attila's forces from earlier barbarian armies. Cities that had submitted to Hun authority were left intact, while those that had offered resistance found themselves facing continued pressure even as the main army departed. By autumn of 452, Attila had established his winter quarters in Pannonia, the fertile region between the Danube and the Alps that had become the center of Hun power in Europe. The Italian campaign had achieved many of its strategic objectives even without the capture of Rome, demonstrating Hun power while extracting concessions that strengthened Attila's position for future operations. Yet the campaign had also revealed limitations that would influence future Hun policy. The logistical challenges of maintaining large armies in distant territories, the diplomatic complexities of managing multiple simultaneous conflicts, and the growing sophistication of Roman defensive strategies all suggested that the days of easy conquest were ending. Attila's next moves would need to account for these realities while seeking new opportunities to expand Hun power and influence. The winter of 452 settled over Attila's court like a shroud, heavy with unspoken possibilities. In the great halls where fires burned against the cold winds that swept down from the Carpathian mountains, the king of the Huns contemplated achievements that had transformed him into the most feared man in the known world. Yet rather than satisfaction, these reflections brought a restlessness that spoke to ambitions not yet fulfilled, and a vision that stretched beyond even the extraordinary conquests already achieved. The Italian campaign had demonstrated both the heights of Attila's power and the subtle constraints that were beginning to limit even his seemingly unlimited authority. The withdrawal from Rome, while strategically sound, had left some objectives unachieved and created the impression among both enemies and allies that Hun power, while still formidable, was no longer irresistible. This perception, however slight, threatened to undermine the psychological dominance that had been as important as military strength in Attila's rise to supremacy. Reports reaching the Hun court during those dark winter months painted a complex picture of European politics in the aftermath of the Italian expedition. The Eastern Roman Empire, encouraged by Attila's apparent restraint in the West, had begun showing signs of renewed resistance to Hun demands. Tribute payments were arriving late or in reduced amounts, while Byzantine diplomats spoke with a confidence that had been notably absent during the dark days following the Balkan campaigns. The Western Empire, despite its narrow escape from complete conquest, remained vulnerable to renewed pressure. The strain of continuous warfare had exhausted the imperial treasury and decimated the regular army units that had once been the foundation of Roman military power. Emperor Valentinian III's government was increasingly dependent on barbarian allies whose loyalty could not be taken for granted, creating opportunities for the kind of diplomatic manipulation at which Attila excelled. More intriguing were the possibilities emerging from the complex relationships among the various Germanic kingdoms that now controlled much of what had once been Roman territory. The Vandal kingdom in North Africa, under the energetic leadership of King Genseric, was pursuing an increasingly aggressive policy that brought it into conflict with both Roman and Visigothic interests. The resulting tensions created opportunities for a skilled diplomat to position himself as the arbiter of Western European politics. King Genseric had initiated contact with Attila's court during the Italian campaign, proposing a formal alliance that would coordinate Vandal naval operations with Hunland campaigns to achieve the final destruction of Roman power in the West. The proposal had obvious attractions, offering the possibility of attacking Roman territories from multiple directions while dividing the empire's limited resources among several threatened fronts. The Visigothic kingdom in southwestern Gaul presented different opportunities and challenges. The death of King Theodoric I at the Catalaunian plains had elevated his son Thorismund to the throne, but the new king's authority was not yet fully established among all elements of his people. Some Visigothic nobles, particularly those who had suffered losses in the battle against the Huns, were reportedly receptive to the idea of accommodation with Attila, if it could be achieved on terms that preserved their essential interests. These diplomatic possibilities were complicated by developments within the Hun Confederation itself. The extraordinary expansion of Attila's power had attracted followers from throughout the barbarian world, but it had also created internal pressures that threatened to destabilize the traditional structures of steppe society. The wealth flowing from tribute payments and successful campaigns had enabled some tribal leaders to build independent power bases that might challenge central authority if not carefully managed. The integration of so many different peoples into the Hun Confederation had created cultural and linguistic challenges that tested the limits of traditional nomadic political systems. Germanic warriors who had joined Attila's service brought with them different concepts of honor, loyalty, and the proper relationship between leaders and followers. Slavic and other groups added their own traditions and expectations to a mix that was becoming increasingly complex and potentially volatile. Attila's response to these challenges demonstrated the political sophistication that had enabled him to build and maintain his extraordinary coalition. Rather than attempting to impose uniform Hun customs on all his subjects, he developed a flexible system that allowed different groups to maintain their distinctive traditions while ensuring their loyalty to his overall leadership. This approach required constant attention to the delicate balance of competing interests and expectations, but it enabled the Confederation to continue absorbing new peoples without losing internal cohesion. The military preparations that began during the winter of 452 to 453 reflected Attila's determination to address both the external challenges to his authority and the internal pressures that threatened Confederation stability. Rather than launching another massive campaign against a single target, he adopted a strategy that would demonstrate Hun power through multiple simultaneous operations while providing opportunities for his various followers to gain wealth and glory. The first element of this strategy involved renewed pressure on the Eastern Roman Empire, designed to restore the tribute payments and diplomatic deference that had been eroding since the Italian campaign. Rather than mounting another full-scale invasion of the Balkans, Attila planned a series of limited but devastating raids that would remind Constantinople of the consequences of defying Hun authority while conserving resources for other objectives. These eastern operations were entrusted to some of Attila's most experienced commanders, men who had proven their ability to coordinate the complex logistics and tactical maneuvers required for successful campaigns against Roman fortifications. The forces assigned to these raids included substantial numbers of Germanic and other allied troops, whose participation would both demonstrate Confederation unity and provide them with opportunities to gain wealth through successful military action. Simultaneously, Attila began developing plans for intervention in the growing conflict between the Vandal kingdom and its various enemies. The proposal for a formal Vandal-Hun alliance offered attractive possibilities, but it also carried risks that needed to be carefully evaluated. Genseric's aggressive policies had already created a powerful coalition of enemies, and direct Hun support for Vandal operations might provoke a general war that would stretch Confederation resources beyond their limits. The solution that emerged from Attila's strategic deliberations was characteristically subtle and multi-layered. Rather than committing to full support for Vandal objectives, he would provide limited assistance while maintaining the flexibility to adjust his policies based on changing circumstances. This approach would demonstrate Hun power and influence while avoiding the kind of total commitment that might prove difficult to sustain over extended periods. The most ambitious element of Attila's final strategic vision involved the possibility of directly challenging Roman authority in its remaining strongholds. The Italian campaign had demonstrated that even Rome itself was not beyond Hun reach, and the psychological impact of that demonstration had opened new possibilities for diplomatic and military pressure. The question was whether these possibilities could be exploited without triggering the kind of unified resistance that had frustrated Hun objectives in Gaul. The key to this strategy lay in Attila's growing understanding of the internal divisions that were weakening Roman authority from within. The relationship between Emperor Valentinian III and General Aetius had deteriorated significantly following the Italian campaign, creating opportunities for the kind of political manipulation that might achieve through intrigue what military force alone could not accomplish. Intelligence reports suggested that various court factions were actively plotting against each other, with some elements apparently willing to consider accommodation with Hun power if it would serve their immediate political interests. The challenge was to exploit these divisions without revealing Hun involvement in ways that might reunite Roman factions against the common external threat. As spring approached in 453, the pieces were falling into place for what promised to be the most complex and ambitious phase of Attila's career. Multiple simultaneous campaigns were being prepared, diplomatic initiatives were being launched in several directions, and the vast machinery of Hun military and administrative power was being mobilized for operations that would test the limits of even Attila's extraordinary capabilities. The king himself seemed energized by these challenges, displaying the restless dynamism that had characterized his rise to power. Visitors to his court reported that he spent long hours in consultation with his advisors, studying maps and intelligence reports while refining plans that seemed to encompass every aspect of European politics. The boy who had learned to ride and shoot on the endless steppes of Central Asia had become a master of continental strategy, capable of coordinating operations across thousands of miles while managing the complex relationships that held his vast confederation together. Yet there were signs, visible only to those who knew him best, that the enormous pressures of supreme leadership were beginning to take their toll. The constant need to balance competing interests, to appear invincible while managing very real limitations, and to make decisions that affected the lives of millions of people had created strains that even his remarkable constitution could not entirely absorb. The sleepless nights spent in strategic planning were becoming more frequent, while the burden of always being the ultimate arbiter of confederation policy weighed heavily on shoulders that had carried that responsibility for nearly a decade. The irony was that Attila's very success had created the conditions that would make his future challenges more difficult than those he had already overcome. The empire he had built was now so vast and complex that it required constant attention to maintain, while his enemies had learned from their defeats and were developing new strategies to contain Hun expansion. The days when swift cavalry raids could achieve decisive political results were giving way to an era of more complex warfare that demanded different skills and resources. Nevertheless, as the campaign season of 453 approached, Attila remained confident in his ability to overcome whatever challenges lay ahead. The plans taking shape in his headquarters represented the culmination of everything he had learned about warfare, diplomacy, and the management of power during his extraordinary career. If successful, they would establish Hun dominance over European politics for generations to come, while demonstrating that even the mightiest empires of the ancient world could not resist the will of a truly exceptional leader. The stage was set for what many believed would be the final act in the drama that had begun with Attila's rise to power following his brother's death. The question that remained was whether the forces that had carried him to unprecedented heights would prove sufficient for the even greater challenges that lay ahead, or whether the very magnitude of his ambitions would finally exceed even his remarkable capabilities. The great feast that marked the celebration of Attila's latest marriage began as evening shadows fell across the Hun royal compound in the spring of 453. The halls echoed with laughter and the clash of drinking cups, while outside in the encampment, thousands of warriors who had followed their king across half of Europe prepared to celebrate another triumph in his remarkable career. Yet within hours, this joyous occasion would transform into one of history's most mysterious and consequential tragedies. Attila's new bride was Ildiko, a young Germanic woman whose beauty was said to rival that of the legendary queens of ancient times. She was, by most accounts, his 7th or 8th wife, for Hun tradition allowed powerful men to cement political alliances through marriage while demonstrating their wealth and status through the maintenance of elaborate households. Each marriage had served strategic purposes, binding different tribal groups more closely to Attila's cause while producing offspring who might one day inherit portions of his vast empire. This latest wedding had been planned as a magnificent celebration that would demonstrate the wealth and power that Hun expansion had brought to all levels of society. Gold and silver vessels, plundered from Roman cities or received as tribute from defeated enemies, gleamed in the firelight as hundreds of guests consumed the finest foods and wines that the known world could provide. Germanic warriors sat alongside Hun nobles, former Roman citizens alongside Slavic chieftains, all united in their loyalty to the extraordinary man who had raised them to heights their ancestors could never have imagined. The atmosphere of the feast reflected the confidence that pervaded Hun society as Attila prepared for what many believed would be the final campaigns that would establish his dominance over all of Europe. The plans that had been developed over the winter months were beginning to show results, with successful raids against Eastern Roman territories and promising diplomatic developments in several directions. The mood was one of anticipation for even greater triumphs to come. Attila himself appeared to be in excellent spirits throughout the evening, moving among his guests with the easy charisma that had always been one of his greatest assets as a leader. Those who spoke with him reported that he seemed particularly pleased with the progress of his various strategic initiatives and optimistic about the prospects for the coming campaign season. There were no signs of illness or distress that might have warned of the catastrophe that was approaching. As the evening wore on, the king gradually withdrew from the larger celebration to join his new bride in the private chambers that had been prepared for their wedding night. Hun marriage customs included elaborate rituals that were meant to ensure the fertility of the union and the favor of the spirits that governed human relationships. These ceremonies, conducted by shamans and elder women according to traditions that stretched back centuries, continued late into the night. When morning came without any sign of activity from the royal chambers, servants initially assumed that the king was simply enjoying the privileges of his new marriage. Hun customs granted considerable privacy to newlyweds, and it would have been inappropriate to disturb the royal couple without compelling reason. Hours passed before concern began to replace discretion among the household staff. By midday, when Attila had still not emerged from his chambers, and failed to respond to increasingly urgent requests for audiences from his military commanders and diplomatic advisers, his closest associates decided that intervention was necessary despite the potential impropriety. What they found when they finally broke down the door to the royal chambers has become one of history's most enduring mysteries. Attila lay dead in his bed, his face peaceful, but his body already beginning to show the signs of rigor mortis that indicated he had been dead for several hours. There were no obvious signs of violence, no wounds or other injuries that might explain his sudden demise. Beside him, his young bride sat in stunned silence, apparently unharmed, but too shocked to provide coherent explanations of what had transpired during the night. The immediate reaction among Attila's followers was a mixture of disbelief, grief, and growing suspicion about the circumstances surrounding their leader's death. The king had been in apparently perfect health the previous evening, displaying none of the symptoms that might have warned of a natural death. His physical strength and vitality had been legendary throughout his career, making sudden death from illness seem unlikely to those who had known him best. Initial investigations focused on the possibility of poison, the classic weapon of choice for assassins seeking to eliminate powerful leaders without open confrontation. Hun shamans and the few physicians available at the royal court examined the body carefully, looking for signs that might indicate the use of toxic substances. However, their primitive medical knowledge was insufficient to detect many of the poisons that might have been employed by a sophisticated assassin. Suspicion inevitably fell on Ildiko herself, the one person who had been alone with Attila during his final hours. The young woman's Germanic origins made her a natural suspect in the minds of some Hun nobles who had never fully trusted the foreign wives that their king had taken for political reasons. The possibility that she might have been an agent of Roman or other enemies, seeking to eliminate Hun power through treachery, seemed plausible to those struggling to understand how their apparently invincible leader could have died so suddenly. However, careful questioning of Ildiko revealed no evidence of guilty knowledge or malicious intent. Her account of the evening's events, while somewhat confused by shock and grief, suggested that Attila had simply failed to wake up from what had appeared to be normal sleep. She reported no signs of distress or illness during their time together. Nothing that might have warned of the tragedy that was approaching. Alternative theories about the cause of death began to emerge as the initial investigation failed to produce clear evidence of assassination. Some suggested that Attila might have suffered from a previously undiagnosed medical condition that had finally claimed his life at this crucial moment. Others proposed that excessive drinking during the wedding feast might have contributed to a fatal episode, perhaps by triggering a heart attack or stroke in a man who had lived under enormous stress for many years. The most dramatic explanation came from those who interpreted Attila's death as divine intervention, punishment from either Christian god or pagan deities for the destruction he had brought to so many innocent people. This supernatural interpretation gained credence among some followers who had been disturbed by recent changes in their leaders' behavior and policies that seemed to depart from traditional Hun values and customs. As news of Attila's death spread throughout the Hun Confederation and beyond, the immediate consequences were both predictable and catastrophic. The vast military machine that had been preparing for renewed campaigns suddenly found itself without the central authority that had held it together. Regional commanders and tribal chiefs who had subordinated their own ambitions to Attila's supreme leadership now faced the question of whether to continue serving a confederation that might not survive its founder's death. The succession crisis that had been temporarily resolved through Attila's elimination of his brother Bleda now reasserted itself with devastating force. Attila had fathered numerous children through his various marriages, but Hun tradition didn't provide clear rules for determining which son should inherit supreme authority. The Confederation's political structure had been so completely personalized around Attila's individual leadership that no institutional mechanisms existed to manage a smooth transition of power. Within days of the king's death, different factions within the Hun Confederation began choosing sides among his potential successors. Elak, his eldest son, claimed the right of primogeniture and could count on support from some of the more traditional elements within Hun society. Dengizic and Ernak, younger sons with their own followers and territories, rejected their brothers' claims and began building coalitions to support their own bids for power. The paralysis that resulted from this succession struggle created opportunities that Attila's enemies were quick to exploit. The Eastern Roman Empire, which had been preparing to resume tribute payments under renewed Hun pressure, immediately suspended all financial obligations while waiting to see whether the Confederation would survive its founder's death. The Visigothic kingdom began moving forces to reclaim territories that had been lost to Hun expansion. Other Germanic peoples who had been forced into tributary relationships with Attila began testing whether they could reassert their independence. Perhaps most damaging to Hun unity was the reaction of the various peoples who had been incorporated into the Confederation through conquest or alliance. Germanic warriors who had served Attila faithfully began calculating whether their interests would be better served by continued loyalty to a divided Hun leadership or by seeking new arrangements with other powers. The complex web of personal relationships and mutual obligations that had held the Confederation together began unraveling with alarming speed. The funeral arrangements for Attila became a final demonstration of both the wealth he had accumulated and the political divisions that were tearing his empire apart. Hun tradition called for elaborate burial ceremonies that would honor the dead leader while ensuring his protection in the afterlife. But the succession dispute complicated efforts to organize appropriate rituals. Each of his sons wanted to control the funeral arrangements as a way of demonstrating their legitimacy as his heir. The compromise that eventually emerged satisfied no one completely, but prevented the outbreak of civil war during the crucial period immediately following Attila's death. The funeral would be conducted according to traditional Hun customs, but with modifications that reflected the multinational character of the Confederation and the political necessities of the moment. The burial site would be kept secret to prevent desecration by enemies, while the distribution of the king's personal possessions would be postponed until the succession question could be resolved. As Attila's body was prepared for burial according to the ancient customs of his people, messengers carried news of his death to every corner of the known world. In Constantinople, Emperor Marcion received the reports with barely concealed relief, recognizing that the death of his most dangerous enemy had dramatically improved the Eastern Empire's strategic position. In Rome, the papal court offered prayers of thanksgiving for the deliverance of Christendom from its greatest threat. Among the barbarian kingdoms of Europe, reactions were more complex and varied. Some leaders saw Attila's death as an opportunity to escape from tributary relationships and reassert their independence. Others worried that the collapse of Hun power might create a dangerous vacuum that could lead to renewed warfare and instability throughout the region. The delicate balance of power that Attila's dominance had imposed on European politics was beginning to shift in unpredictable directions. The man who had risen from the steppes of Central Asia to become the terror of Europe was gone, but the consequences of his remarkable career would continue to shape the destiny of the continent for generations to come. His death marked the end of an era in which a single extraordinary individual had been able to unite the barbarian peoples and challenge the supremacy of Rome itself. The question that remained was whether the civilization he had threatened would prove strong enough to survive the chaos that his passing had unleashed. In the hushed hours before dawn, when the mist rose from the rivers and the world seemed caught between night and day, the greatest funeral procession in barbarian history began its final journey across the Hungarian plain. The body of Attila, wrapped in silks that had traveled the length of the Silk Road and adorned with gold that had once filled Roman treasuries, rode upon a wagon pulled by the finest horses in his vast herds. Around him moved a cortege that represented the full diversity of the empire he had created. Warriors and nobles from dozens of peoples united one last time in honor of the leader who had raised them all to heights their ancestors could never have imagined. The funeral arrangements had taken weeks to organize, as Hun shamans consulted ancient traditions while adapting them to reflect the unprecedented status that Attila had achieved during his lifetime. This was not merely the burial of a tribal chief or war leader, but the final ceremony for a man who had held dominion over territories stretching from the steppes of Asia to the Atlantic shores of Gaul. The rituals that surrounded his burial would need to honor both the ancient customs of the steppes and the imperial pretensions that his conquests had made possible. According to the account left by the historian Jordanes, who drew his information from men who had witnessed the events, the funeral cortege was accompanied by the most skilled horsemen among Attila's followers, who rode in elaborate formations around the funeral wagon while chanting the ancient songs that celebrated the deeds of fallen heroes. Their voices carried across the plains like the wind itself, telling the story of a boy born in a felt yurt who had grown to shake the foundations of the civilized world. The songs they sang had been composed by Hun bards during Attila's lifetime, epic verses that traced his rise from joint ruler with his brother to the sole master of the largest barbarian confederation in history. They told of his campaigns in the Balkans, where Roman cities had fallen before his advance, like wheat before the scythe. They recalled the great battle of the Catalaunian plains, where the flower of Roman and Germanic chivalry had barely managed to halt his westward expansion. They celebrated his march into Italy, where even the eternal city of Rome had trembled at his approach. But the funeral songs also served a deeper purpose, embedding Attila's memory in the collective consciousness of his people while establishing the legitimacy of those who claimed to be his heirs. Each verse that praised his victories also reinforced the authority of the Hun Confederation, suggesting that his power lived on through the institutions and relationships he had created. This was not merely a funeral, but a political statement designed to smooth the transition from personal rule to the more complex arrangements that would be necessary to maintain Hun unity after their great leader's death. The destination of the funeral procession was a secret known only to Attila's most trusted followers, men who had sworn oaths that bound them to carry the knowledge of his burial place to their own graves. Hun tradition demanded that great leaders be buried in hidden locations, protected from the desecration that enemies might inflict upon their remains, and from the treasure seekers who would inevitably come looking for the wealth that was interred with them. The location chosen for Attila's final resting place reflected both practical considerations and symbolic meanings that were important to Hun culture. It lay somewhere in the Great Plain between the Danube and the Tisa rivers, in territory that had been conquered early in Attila's career and remained firmly under Hun control. The exact spot was significant for reasons that went beyond mere security, representing a landscape that embodied the marriage between nomadic traditions and settled power that had characterized his reign. Contemporary sources describe the preparation of the burial site in terms that seem almost mythological in their grandeur, yet archaeological evidence suggests that wealthy steppe burials could indeed involve extraordinary displays of wealth and craftsmanship. According to the most detailed accounts, 3 successive coffins were prepared to hold Attila's remains, each representing a different aspect of the empire he had built and the values he had embodied. The innermost coffin was made of gold, that most precious of metals which had flowed into Hun territory through tribute payments, successful campaigns, and diplomatic negotiations. The gold represented not merely wealth, but the ultimate expression of earthly power and the divine favor that Hun tradition associated with successful leadership. Every ounce of this precious metal had been won through Attila's victories, making it a fitting symbol of the achievement that had elevated him above all other barbarian leaders. Surrounding the golden coffin was another made of silver, representing the diplomatic skill and political sophistication that had been as important as military prowess in building Hun dominance. Silver was the metal of tribute and negotiation, the medium through which relationships between peoples were formalized and maintained. Its inclusion in Attila's burial reflected the understanding that his empire had been built as much through clever diplomacy as through battlefield victories. The outermost coffin was constructed of iron, the metal of war and the foundation of Hun military superiority. Iron was the material from which came the arrowheads that could pierce Roman armor, the sword blades that had decided the fate of kingdoms, and the tools that enabled nomadic peoples to create and maintain the weapons of conquest. Its presence in the burial represented the fundamental truth that all of Attila's achievements had ultimately rested on his ability to organize and deploy military force more effectively than his enemies. The treasures that were buried with Attila reflected the international scope of his empire and the diverse sources of his wealth. Roman gold and silver vessels, plundered from cities or received as tribute, lay alongside Germanic jewelry and weapons that demonstrated the multinational character of his confederation. Silk textiles from China, precious stones from India, and amber from the Baltic shores all found their way into the burial chamber, creating a collection that represented the full extent of the trade networks and political relationships that Hun expansion had made possible. But perhaps the most significant treasures buried with Attila were the symbols of authority that had been developed during his reign. These included crowns or diadems that may have been modeled on Roman imperial regalia, ceremonial weapons that represented his military leadership, and seals or other instruments of government that had been used to administer his vast territories. These objects were not merely valuable in material terms, but embodied the political revolution that had transformed a traditional nomadic confederation into something approaching a centralized state. The ritual aspects of the burial ceremony reflected the complex religious traditions that had evolved within the Hun Confederation as it absorbed peoples with different spiritual beliefs and practices. Hun shamans conducted the primary ceremonies, calling upon the sky god and the spirits of the steppes to protect their dead leader and ensure his successful journey to the afterlife. But these traditional rituals were supplemented by elements drawn from the religious practices of subject peoples, creating a syncretic ceremony that reflected the multicultural nature of Attila's empire. Christian elements may also have been included in the burial, reflecting both the presence of Christian subjects within the Hun Confederation and the diplomatic relationships that Attila had maintained with the Christian Roman Empire. Some accounts suggest that Christian prisoners or voluntary converts participated in the funeral ceremonies, their prayers joining with pagan invocations in a remarkable display of religious tolerance that had characterized Hun policy throughout Attila's reign. The most dramatic and controversial aspect of the funeral involved the fate of those who had participated in the burial ceremony itself. According to several historical accounts, all of the workers who had prepared the gravesite and handled the burial treasures were killed immediately after the ceremony to ensure that the location of Attila's tomb would remain secret. This act of mass sacrifice, while horrifying to modern sensibilities, reflected both the enormous value placed on maintaining the secrecy of the burial site and the expendable nature of human life in the harsh world of 5th century warfare. The killings were reportedly carried out by Hun nobles who had not been involved in the actual burial preparations, ensuring that at least some of Attila's closest followers would survive to maintain the continuity of leadership during the critical transition period. The men who died were said to have accepted their fate willingly, viewing their sacrifice as a final service to the leader who had brought them wealth and glory beyond their dreams. But the most mysterious aspect of the funeral involved the final disposition of the burial site itself. According to the account preserved by Jordanes, the location where Attila was buried was not simply hidden, but was actually obliterated to prevent its discovery by future generations. A river was reportedly diverted to flow over the gravesite, ensuring that no trace would remain visible to mark the location where the scourge of God had been laid to rest. This extraordinary measure reflected both the Hun understanding of the value of the treasures buried with their king and their recognition that his enemies would stop at nothing to desecrate his remains if they could discover their location. The diversion of a river was an engineering project that would have required enormous effort and resources, but it provided the ultimate protection for a burial that contained wealth beyond calculation. The completion of Attila's funeral marked not merely the end of his personal story, but the beginning of a new and more uncertain chapter in the history of the peoples he had united under his leadership. The ceremony had provided a temporary focus for Hun unity, allowing the various factions within the Confederation to come together in honoring their dead leader. But once the rituals were completed and the immediate requirements of tradition had been satisfied, the underlying tensions that had been held in check by Attila's personal authority began to reassert themselves with devastating effect. The sons of Attila, who had maintained an uneasy truce during the funeral preparations, now resumed their competition for the inheritance of their father's empire. Each claimed to embody different aspects of his legacy, and each attracted followers who believed that their chosen leader offered the best hope for maintaining Hun power and prosperity. The political unity that had been Attila's greatest achievement began fragmenting under the pressure of competing ambitions and conflicting visions of the Confederation's future. Within months of the funeral, the first open conflicts broke out between different factions within the Hun Confederation. What began as political disagreements soon escalated into armed confrontations that divided the military forces that had once been unified under Attila's command. The momentum of conquest that had carried Hun armies across half of Europe was dissipated in civil wars that consumed the resources and manpower that might have been used to maintain external dominance. The secret of Attila's burial place has been preserved to this day, despite centuries of speculation and numerous attempts to locate the site through historical research and archaeological investigation. The river that was diverted to conceal his grave has itself changed course over the intervening centuries, while the landscape of the Hungarian plain has been transformed by agricultural development and modern construction. The location where the greatest of barbarian kings was laid to rest remains one of history's most enduring mysteries. Yet in a deeper sense, Attila's true burial place was not the hidden grave where his body molded with its treasures, but in the memories and legends that grew up around his remarkable career. The funeral ceremonies that marked his physical death also began the process by which he was transformed from a historical figure into a mythological presence that would influence European consciousness for centuries to come. The first winter after Attila's death settled over the Hun territories like a prophecy of dissolution. Where once the great king's authority had provided unity and direction to dozens of tribal groups and subject peoples. Now there was only confusion and growing conflict as his heirs struggled to claim portions of an inheritance too vast for any of them to control alone. The empire that had taken decades to build began crumbling within months of its founder's passing, victim of the same personal nature that had been the source of its greatest strength. Ellak, the eldest of Attila's sons, had initially seemed the most likely candidate to inherit supreme authority over the Confederation. His claim was based on Hun traditions regarding succession, and he commanded support from many of the older, more conservative elements within nomadic society who preferred familiar customs to dangerous innovations. However, his attempts to assert control over the entire inheritance brought him into immediate conflict with his brothers, each of whom controlled substantial military forces and territorial bases that they were unwilling to surrender to his authority. The civil war that erupted between Attila's heirs was characterized by the same swift and brutal efficiency that had marked Hun military operations under unified leadership, but now turned inward in fratricidal conflict that devastated the very foundations of Confederation power. Cavalry forces that had once swept across Europe in coordinated campaigns now clashed against each other in battles that achieved nothing beyond mutual destruction. The wealth that had been accumulated through tribute and conquest was squandered in financing military operations that benefited no one except the enemies who watched Hun power destroy itself. Dengizic and Ernak, the younger sons who had rejected Ellak's claims to supreme authority, proved no more capable of maintaining unity than their elder brother. Each established his own court and attempted to attract followers from among the various peoples who had been incorporated into the Confederation during Attila's reign. These competing claims created a situation in which tribal leaders and military commanders were forced to choose sides in conflicts that offered few benefits, regardless of their outcome. The fragmentation of Hun leadership created opportunities that the Confederation's subject peoples were quick to exploit. Germanic tribes that had been forced into tributary relationships with Attila began asserting their independence, in many cases transferring their allegiances to Roman authorities who offered protection against Hun reprisals. The Gepids, who had been among the most reliable allies during the great campaigns, emerged as active opponents of continued Hun dominance under the leadership of King Ardaric, who had been one of Attila's most trusted generals. The revolt of the Gepids represented more than simple opportunism in the face of Hun weakness. Ardaric and his followers had served faithfully during Attila's lifetime, participating in campaigns from the Balkans to Italy and sharing in the wealth and glory that success had brought to all elements of the Confederation. Their decision to break with Hun leadership reflected a calculated judgment that the political structure created by Attila could not survive his death, and that their interests would be better served by independence than by continued loyalty to his divided heirs. The coalition that formed around Gepid leadership included many of the peoples who had chafed under Hun domination, but had been unable to resist while Attila lived. Ostrogoths, Rugians, Heruli, and other Germanic groups contributed forces to an alliance that represented a reversal of the political relationships that had characterized Central and Eastern Europe for decades. Where these peoples had once served as auxiliaries in Hun armies, they now united in opposition to their former masters. The decisive confrontation between the collapsing Hun confederation and the coalition of subject peoples took place in 454 at the Battle of Nidau, fought somewhere along the river of that name in what is now eastern Austria. The battle represented a dramatic reversal of the military relationships that had enabled Hun expansion, as Germanic infantry and cavalry faced Hun forces that were no longer unified under effective central command. Ellak, who had been attempting to reassert Hun dominance through military action, led his forces into battle with the confidence of a man whose father had never known defeat. However, the army he commanded bore little resemblance to the disciplined and coordinated forces that Attila had wielded with such devastating effect. Divided loyalties within Hun ranks, combined with the loss of many allied contingents that had defected to the enemy, created vulnerabilities that more experienced commanders might have avoided. The Battle of Nidau became a massacre that effectively ended Hun dominance in Central Europe. Ellak himself was killed in the fighting, along with many of the nobles and military leaders who might have provided continuity in Hun political organization. The defeat was so complete that it shattered any remaining hope that the Confederation could maintain its territorial control or continue extracting tribute from former subject peoples. The immediate aftermath of Nidau saw a wholesale collapse of Hun authority throughout the territories that Attila had controlled at the height of his power. Cities that had paid tribute to Hun administrators ceased their payments and transferred their allegiances to new protectors. Trade networks that had been organized around Hun political control fragmented into competing local systems. The complex administrative machinery that had enabled governance of vast territories simply dissolved as the personnel and resources needed to maintain it disappeared. Dengizic and Ernak, the surviving sons of Attila, found themselves reduced to the status of minor tribal leaders controlling fragments of their father's former empire. Their attempts to maintain some semblance of Hun power led them in different directions, each seeking allies and opportunities that might enable a restoration of their family's fortunes. However, the changed political landscape of post-Attila Europe offered few opportunities for the kind of expansion that had built their father's empire. Dengizic chose to maintain pressure on the Roman Empire, hoping that successful raids and the extraction of tribute might restore Hun prestige and attract new followers to his diminished forces. His campaigns against both eastern and western Roman territories achieved some tactical successes, but they lacked the strategic coherence and overwhelming force that had characterized his father's operations. Roman defenders, no longer facing the prospect of coordinated attacks by hundreds of thousands of warriors, proved capable of containing these smaller-scale incursions. Ernak adopted a different strategy, seeking to establish a stable territorial base from which Hun power might gradually be rebuilt. He negotiated agreements with the Eastern Roman Empire that provided his followers with lands in exchange for military service, essentially transforming his portion of the Confederation into a foederati arrangement similar to those that had been established with other Germanic peoples. This approach offered greater security, but represented a fundamental abandonment of the independent power that had been the foundation of Hun identity. The fate that befell these remnants of Attila's dynasty reflected the broader transformation that was reshaping European politics in the aftermath of the great king's death. Dengisich was eventually killed in battle against Roman forces in 469, his head sent to Constantinople as proof that the last serious Hun threat to imperial security had been eliminated. Ernak and his followers gradually disappeared from historical records as they were absorbed into the complex ethnic mixture that was emerging in the territories between the Danube and the Black Sea. The disappearance of effective Hun power created a political vacuum that was filled by the very peoples who had been subject to Attila's authority during his lifetime. The Ostrogothic kingdom that emerged under Theodoric the Great would eventually control much of Italy and the Balkans, territories that had once acknowledged Hun supremacy. The Lombards, Gepids, and other Germanic groups established kingdoms that dominated Central Europe for centuries. Their success built partly on the military techniques and political lessons they had learned during their service in Attila's confederation. The Roman Empire, both Eastern and Western, survived the Hun threat, but emerged from the experience fundamentally transformed. The Western Empire, which had seemed on the verge of complete collapse during Attila's Italian campaign, managed to maintain a shadow existence for another generation before finally succumbing to Germanic conquest in 476. The Eastern Empire, which had paid enormous tributes to maintain peace with the Huns, found its financial resources severely strained, but its territorial integrity largely intact. Perhaps more importantly, the Hun period had demonstrated both the vulnerability of traditional Roman military and administrative systems and the need for new approaches to frontier defense and barbarian relations. The federate arrangements that had been developed partly in response to Hun pressure became the foundation for the military organization of the Byzantine Empire, while the diplomatic techniques pioneered in dealing with Attila influenced imperial policy for centuries to come. The cultural and psychological impact of the Hun invasions extended far beyond their immediate political and military consequences. For the first time since the campaigns of Hannibal, a non-Roman power had demonstrated the ability to threaten Rome itself, shattering assumptions about imperial invincibility that had persisted for centuries. The memory of Hun cavalry appearing beneath the walls of Roman cities would influence European military thinking throughout the medieval period. Christianity, which had been gradually replacing pagan traditions throughout the Roman world, found in the Hun invasions both a supreme test of faith and a powerful source of religious inspiration. The meeting between Pope Leo I and Attila became the subject of countless artistic and literary works that portrayed the encounter as a victory of spiritual over temporal power. The deliverance of Rome from Hun conquest was interpreted as evidence of divine protection for the Christian Church and its temporal defenders. The legends that grew up around Attila's career reflected the complex and often contradictory emotions that his memory evoked among different European peoples. In Roman and Christian sources, it was typically portrayed as the scourge of God, an instrument of divine wrath sent to punish a sinful world. This interpretation allowed writers to acknowledge his extraordinary achievements while placing them within a theological framework that ultimately affirmed the superiority of Christian civilization. Germanic traditions, however, preserved a more ambiguous memory of the great Hun king. While recognizing the destruction that his campaigns had brought to many communities, these sources also acknowledged his role as a leader who had elevated barbarian peoples to unprecedented heights of power and prestige. The Nibelungenlied and other medieval epics portrayed him as a generous host and a mighty warrior, admirable in his virtues, even if terrible in his power. The archaeological evidence for Hun culture and civilization has proved remarkably elusive, reflecting both the nomadic nature of their society and the thoroughness with which their political organization disappeared following Attila's death. Unlike the Romans, who left behind extensive written records and monumental architecture, or the Germanic peoples who established lasting kingdoms, the Huns seem to have vanished from the material record almost as completely as they had appeared in the historical sources. This archaeological invisibility has contributed to the mythological status that Attila and his people have acquired in popular consciousness. Without the concrete evidence that might humanize them and place their achievements in prosaic context, the Huns remain figures of legend, their reality obscured by the fears and fantasies of those who recorded their deeds. Attila himself has become less a historical personage than a symbol of barbarian power at its most threatening and effective. Modern historical scholarship has attempted to reconstruct a more balanced understanding of Hun society and Attila's achievements, drawing on comparative studies of other nomadic civilizations and careful analysis of the scattered contemporary sources. This work has revealed the sophisticated political and military organization that made Hun expansion possible, while placing their conquests within the broader context of the transformation of European civilization during the 4th and 5th centuries. The picture that emerges from this scholarship is of a remarkably adaptive and innovative society that successfully bridged the gap between nomadic and settled civilizations. Under Attila's leadership, the Huns developed administrative and military techniques that enabled them to govern vast territories and diverse populations more effectively than many conventional states. Their failure to create lasting institutions reflected not the primitive nature of their society, but the intensely personal character of steppe leadership traditions. The ultimate significance of Attila and the Hun Confederation lies not in their military conquests, impressive though these were, but in their role as catalysts for the transformation of European civilization. The pressure they exerted on Roman frontiers accelerated the process by which Germanic peoples established independent kingdoms within former imperial territories. The diplomatic and military techniques they pioneered influenced the development of medieval warfare and statecraft. The memory of their achievements provided inspiration for later nomadic conquerors who would again threaten the stability of settled civilizations. In the quiet hours before dawn, when historians contemplate the great sweep of human events, Attila's career appears as a moment of extraordinary possibility that briefly illuminated the ancient world before flickering out like a candle in the wind. His story is one of individual genius, channeled through the collective energies of a people uniquely suited to the challenges and opportunities of their historical moment. The empire he created could not outlive its founder, but the memory of what he achieved would inspire and terrify future generations who faced their own challenges in building and defending civilizations. The steppes from which Attila emerged remain largely unchanged, vast grasslands where the wind still carries echoes of ancient migrations and forgotten empires. The cities he conquered have been rebuilt many times over, their Roman foundations buried beneath layers of medieval, Renaissance, and modern construction. The rivers along which his armies marched continue their eternal journey to the sea, indifferent to the human dramas that once played out along their banks. Yet in the stories that parents tell their children, in the books that scholars write, and in the dreams of those who wonder what might have been, Attila lives on. The boy who learned to ride and shoot on the endless plains of Central Asia, who grew to unite the barbarian peoples and shake the foundations of the Roman world, who died mysteriously at the height of his power and was buried in a secret grave that has never been found, remains one of history's most compelling figures. His legacy is written not in stone monuments or imperial chronicles, but in the transformation of European civilization itself. The world that emerged from the ashes of his empire was fundamentally different from the one he had challenged, shaped by the encounter between nomadic and settled peoples, between barbarian energy and classical tradition, between the old certainties of Roman dominance and the new realities of a continent in transition. And so, the story ends where it began, in the vast silences of the steppes, where the wind carries the whispers of history across landscapes that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Attila the Hun, the scourge of God, sleeps in his hidden grave, while the world he changed continues its eternal dance between order and chaos, civilization and barbarism, the known and the unknowable. His name echoes still across the centuries, a reminder that even the mightiest empires are mortal, and that sometimes, in the right hands at the right moment, the impossible becomes inevitable. The stars that shone down on his birth still wheel across the night sky above the Hungarian plains, silent witnesses to the brief flowering of human ambition that transformed a nomadic confederation into the terror of Europe. In their ancient light, the story of Attila seems both monumentally important and infinitesimally small, a single thread in the vast tapestry of human experience that connects the distant past to the uncertain future. And in that connection, perhaps, lies the true meaning of his extraordinary life. Not in the territories conquered or the enemies defeated, but in the demonstration that individual will, channeled through collective purpose and historical circumstance, can indeed change the course of human events. The boy from the steppes became the master of Europe not through accident of birth or favor of circumstance, but through the relentless application of intelligence, courage, and determination to the challenges of his time. His grave remains hidden, his treasures undiscovered, his exact resting place a mystery that may never be solved. But his story lives on, a reminder that in every age, in every generation, there are moments when the impossible becomes possible, when the patterns of history shift, and when a single life can illuminate the darkness and show us what human beings are capable of achieving when they dare to reach beyond the limitations that others would impose upon them. Sleep now, and dream of endless grasslands beneath starlit skies, of swift horses and singing arrows, of golden treasures and hidden graves, of a king who came from nowhere to shake the world and then vanished into legend, leaving behind only questions, wonder, and the eternal mystery of what might have been.